Very happy to get started here for tonight's event. It's great to see yet again a full house, and I'm not surprised considering the program we have for you this evening. I do see some new faces here, so let me take a moment here to tell you a little bit about myself and the Heartland Institute. My name is Jim Lakely. I am the Director of Communications here at the Heartland Institute. We are a 35-year-old free market think tank that was born in Chicago, Illinois in 1984 by libertarian economists getting around a table and deciding that while they do a lot of free market work, or try to, in Washington, D.C., that the rest of the country, the heartland, needs its own think tank to address these issues and to look at different audiences, like perhaps state legislators, instead of trying to get nothing done in Congress. You can get a lot more done in a state legislature, and so that's kind of our specialty, and we've been doing that now for more than 3 decades. I also want to thank, over the years we've become real close with our friends at AM 560, The Answer. Mike is here and Paul is here, and it's been great to have them this spring so far, kind of being co-sponsors of these events. I know Jonathan was on the radio this morning on AM 560 promoting the event. I think we're already sold out, so if anyone coming through the door is going to be bounced right out of here, or else the fire department's going to have some trouble with us. But if you see up here, there's this red mystery bag up here, full of goodies from our friends at AM 560. So if you have not yet visited Paul at this table and dropped and filled out a piece of paper and put it into that little fishbowl, I'll be fishing a name out of there, and somebody here gets a wonderful bag of mystery goods, which is great. Yep. So at the Heartland Institute, we have, like I said, we're a free market, libertarian, conservative think tank. Some people put conservative in front of the slash. Some people put libertarian first. But again, we believe in free markets. And we believe in fighting for liberty and freedom. And frankly, we have a new project these days called Stopping Socialism, which when we started this project before the election, we didn't think it was going to be, all that big. We didn't know if anybody was really going to get excited about stopping socialism. Why would we need to do that? It's just some nut job from Vermont with who's never going to be president. I mean, what kind of threat is that? And then the 2018 elections happened, and suddenly we were ahead of the curve, so that's nice. Our executive editor, Justin Haskins, has been doing a ton of writing on this. He was writing so well on this that FoxNews.com asked him to be a regular contributor and started promoting his columns. He's been on the Glenn Beck program. Glenn Beck actually just did a whole special on socialism, and Heartland's Justin Haskins was a featured speaker and guest on that program. You can, if you have the Blaze TV, you can go out and check it out at your leisure. He's been on Tucker Carlson Tonight, Fox and Friends. Stuart Varney on the Fox Business Channel is, basically stalking him at this point. He's been on the show so often. And so he's actually got a lot of traction out of something that happened to him, and we talked about this a little bit on the podcast I did with our guest tonight. Earlier, he was deplatformed by Facebook because he committed the crime. Well, I know that's not good. Well, Facebook may not be good, but he had his ad account deleted, and he appealed and he had conversations, and this went on for weeks, and they got tired of hearing from him and said, you know what, you're out. You're deplatformed. You're no longer able to give us money like you had done 100 times to promote your work. And the offending thing was a video the Heartland Institute actually made that was supposed to appeal to millennials to get them to embrace liberty and freedom and reject the socialism garbage that they've been brought up with their entire lives. And they see superstar political people touting socialism. That was too far for Facebook, and so they banned his ad account until he made a stink about it on Fox News, and then we had a conversation with the Facebook people. They actually called us here at the Heartland Institute. Facebook has a conservative outreach coordinator. In the witness protection program? Yeah, sure. And so I got to speak to that fine gentleman, and we straightened it out. So Justin got his ad account back up, mostly because of the bad publicity they got. But this is where society is coming to. This is what happens in a society that no longer embraces liberty and no longer understands its history, how and why America was founded. And we're going to learn a lot tonight about what that is really all about and how important it is to ensure we preserve it. One other quick housekeeping announcement. I know that the Heartland Institute, we're known globally for our work on climate change, promoting the best scientists and policy experts who do not believe that human activity is causing a catastrophic climate crisis, and that the only solution, as always, is government taking over everything, taking away your liberty, managing economies, telling you what, how much water pressure can come out of your shower, what car you have to drive, all of that. We lead the fight on that. And we've been working this week, and I'm making an announcement here really publicly for the first time. On July 25th, at the Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C., the Heartland Institute will be holding our 13th International Conference on Climate Change. We expect a full house there, lots of media attention, and we're very excited about that. So a lot of you who know us for that work have been asking, when are you going to do another climate crisis? The answer is this summer. So there you go. And so, as I say, if you like what you see tonight and hear tonight, if you're watching on our live streams, we ask you to look around heartland.org. You're going to see a lot more that you like. You can check out our blog, The Freedom Pub, which has a lot of great work on it every day. Heartland's daily podcast on iTunes and Google Play and SoundCloud was downloaded 3.2 million times in 2018, and we're on pace to top 4 million downloads this year. And of course, you can check out our YouTube page where you can see presentations like this tonight, plus other videos that we make. Our great talented video producer, Andy Singer, in the back of the room, makes these videos to appeal to his generation, millennials and Gen Y, to put forward these ideas of freedom. And so I hope you will find more that you like, and I hope that maybe you consider becoming a donor or even a volunteer at the Heartland Institute. This is hard work, standing up for liberty, and sometimes there's a lot of headwind, and we could use all the help we can get. With that, I want to introduce and get our program begun today. I'm going to introduce the editors, an editor, and some of the authors of the new Textbook of Americanism, the Politics of Ayn Rand. Jonathan Hoenig is a Fox News contributor. Clap for Jonathan, please. He's a Fox News contributor, prolific author and investor, and proud capitalist. He's also a Chicago native. He attended Northwestern University before leaving school as a senior in the 1990s to pursue his dream of trading on the floor of the Chicago Board of Trade. In 2000, he started the awesomely named Capitalist Pig Hedge Fund, LLC, and it was the first hedge fund to advertise to the general public since 1933. He's a man and a trader of the people, which is great. Also speaking tonight is Amy Peikoff. She's an attorney, an author, speaker, and a writer about the work of Ayn Rand. After completing her law degree at UCLA, where she served as an editor of the UCLA Law Review, she went to USC, where she earned her PhD in philosophy. She has taught at Southwestern Law School, Chapman University School of Law, the United States Air Force Academy, the University of North Carolina, and the University of Texas. And third, we have Richard Salsman. He's the founder, president, and chief market strategist of the investment firm IFI. From 1981 to 1992, he was a respected banker and capital markets analyst at institutions including Citibank and the Bank of New York. He's also the author of 3 books, The Political Economy of Public Debt, Gold and Liberty, and Breaking the Banks, Central Banking Problems and a Free Banking Solution. Objectivists all, this is going to be a fantastic discussion tonight together. Let's have a round of applause for all of our speakers as we bring up Jonathan Hoenig.
Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you to the Heartland Institute, to AM 560, and to all of you more than anything for being here. Just delighted to see the full house and so many new faces and some familiar ones as well. We have a big topic tonight. America, Americanism. What is it? What is this country about? It's up for grabs now in a way that it really has never been before. What are the principles on which the country was based? And does America today reflect those principles? And how can we make sure that it does? I'll give you a quick background. All right, I'll give you a quick background about myself. As Jim mentioned, I've been a professional investor since 2000. I started trading commodities in the 1990s at the Board of Trade. I'd always wanted to do that, and now, of course, it's all electronic, but I was down there in the pits for a short period of time. I am a Fox News analyst, so if you have seen me, you probably have only seen me from the waist up. A lot of different sweater or jacket combinations over the years. And most importantly, and obviously why I'm here is... Oh, right. Well, you've seen me argue with Judge Janine about everything from animal rights on down, but I'm here because I am the editor of this important new book, a new textbook of Americanism. And I have to say, I'm really delighted to be here in particular. I've known of the Heartland Institute for well over 10 years. I reviewed one of Joe Bast's wonderful books about capitalism and education for the Sun Times quite a long time ago. And Heartland has always presented this consistent, principled advocacy for free markets on a host of different topics, from education to property rights. And Heartland has presented, and I think that's why we're so especially delighted to be here, an ideological cause, an ideological crusade. And I don't normally quote Kanye West. He's certainly not in the book, but he was right when he said that it is all about ideas. Ideas are what move the world. And Americanism in particular is really on the ropes right now, because everyone thinks that they understand. I mean, America is a topic that anyone is really easy and welcome to talk about. They think they understand what it's about, right? I mean, Trump and the Democrats, or the so-called left and the so-called right, they all have a vision of what they think that the country basically stands for. It's this big choice, supposedly, right? On one side, you've got Trump. The other side, you have socialism, or you have Sanders. What we believe, and I believe what Ayn Rand would put forth, is that, in fact, today in America, this is a false choice. What is Americanism? I mean, is it conservatism, American as apple pie? Is Americanism burgers and guns? You often see this as being associated with America. It's all gun, yeah, bacon and guns, right? This is America about kneeling? It wasn't too long ago, you might remember, that the president actually said that people who kneel during the anthem shouldn't even be in this country. So is that what makes America great, if you will, kneeling? Is it saluting? Is that saluting still important if you're saluting dictatorships? Is it buy American and hire American? Or is it the supposed opposite, I am my brother's keeper, right? These are the two alternatives that were presented in America today. And once again, this is a false choice. So let's get to it. What is American? What is America's real foundational principle? The thing that you don't hear talked about anywhere in the political realm these days. It's individualism. That is America's secret sauce. If you had to say, what's the unique thing that makes America truly what it is, truly exceptional, it is individualism. Individual rights is the fundamental of what America is all about. America was created on that one idea that the individual has rights. Not God. It's not about God in America. It's not about the Queen. It's not about sacrifice to the tribe. It's not about majority rule in America. It's not about country first properly in America. It's about you. It's about the individual. The individual is the standard of value in America. That was a revolution. It still is a revolution. Now let's take a quick time out here, because rights is a term you hear a lot these days. I have a right to this. I have a right to that. Let's quickly define our terms. What rights are not? Housing is not a right. Healthcare is not a right. A right to education. None of these are rights as properly understood and as Ayn Rand talks about them. A right is a right to action. You have a right to act. It's not to get something for free. You have a right to a freebie from someone else. So, for example, and Jim touched about this a little bit. I know this is a hot topic in many circles these days. You have a right to free speech, but you don't have the promise that anyone is going to give you a platform. So on this, I thought I'd do a little editing. I know Twitter doesn't have an edit button yet, but I thought I'd edit the president's tweet quickly. I'm continuing to monitor the censorship of American citizens on social media platforms. Well, let's just change that. It's not censorship. It's freedom. I mean, that's what these are, private companies. It's the freedom on social media platforms. And, presidents really should be monitoring it. It should be more like celebrating it, right? Celebrating the freedom. And more than anything, not interfering in private, voluntary affairs. You don't have a right to be on Facebook, to be on Twitter, to be anywhere else. So there. President Trump, I fixed it for you. I think that earns a retweet, doesn't it not? Same thing with healthcare, right? The right to purchase healthcare, but not the right to have anyone provide it for you. Certainly not to have others forced to pay for it. So there isn't a difference. We keep talking tonight about this false choice in America right now. Supposedly we have the right on the Republicans that are the capitalists, and the Democrats are the so-called socialists. There really ultimately isn't a difference between Trump vowing insurance for everyone and Bernie Sanders talking about Medicare for all. They've both given in to the same principle that you're a sacrifice for your neighbor, and that healthcare is a right to be provided by who? By someone else. It's that false choice once again. So, when we talk about a free society, what does that mean? Well, it means free from force. It means free from coercion. It means free from government. Not only government, but also means being free from others who would do harm for you. So, it's the extraction of physical force from society, both the robber, right, that's pretty obvious, but even more importantly as well, it's government. It's the extraction of government force from society. This was and is a revolution not frequently practiced in America today, but should be. So very quickly, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was actually used about a decade ago in a Cadillac campaign, ad campaign, you might remember that. And I remember shaking my hand and saying, like, that's not something, I mean, I'm as commercial as they get. I'm all about commercialism, but life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness means something. It means life, you have a right to your own life. Liberty, you have a right to your own liberty, to think what you want, to act how you want. Property, to earn and keep your property, the effort of your labor. And of course, the pursuit of happiness, to choose what constitutes your happiness and then to go out and get it. And the thing about America that you never hear is that it's selfish. If you notice the cover of the book, America is about you. When we talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it's not about your neighbor or the farmers or the steelworkers or the greater good. It's about your happiness. This, again, completely revolutionary in morality and in the world. This is the conventional morality, right? Sacrifice is good. For who? For anyone. In fact, I have a few of these coins here right now. I don't know, you could probably spend these in less places than even the Venezuelan currency I was passing out, but these are Nazi coins from the Third Reich. Available at capitalistpig.com. I'll just see me after the presentation. But it's really instructive about what the Nazis had on the side, on the coin, the side of each coin, the edge of each coin. I don't speak German, but I know what it translates to. The community comes before the individual. This was inscribed on the side of every Nazi coin, just the opposite of that Americanist idea that your life belongs to you. And that is the American individualist morality, that I'm not a sacrifice, I am my own man with the same rights as everyone else. Does it work? Look around. Look at the abundance that Americanism has created over the years. Americanism heralded this natural aristocracy like never before. And before America, it was all about what? The caste system. Where you came from, who your parents were, what color was your skin, were you part of this tribe or that tribe. America did away with all of that. And the net result has been, as we know, the most prosperous society in the history of the world. An amazing statistic here, this is from Pew. The person in the bottom 5% of America, the so-called 90, and it's not even 99%, they're really the low-income people in America are richer than 68% of the world's inhabitants. And it doesn't come out because the water here, is so different. It's the ideas. Bring us back to where we started. It's those individualistic ideas. In America, 56% of Americans would be considered high income on a world scale. So that's what this individualism has promoted and created. Tremendous wealth, tremendous abundance for all. And we have just a few examples here. Henry Ford, of course, changed transportation. Walt Disney changed entertainment. And we could go on, ad infinitum with the Americans who've transformed our lives in innumerable positive ways. Sam Walton, of course, from retail, and then more recently, I'm old enough to remember when Walmart was going to take over everything, and we needed to get government to get in there to do something about Walmart. Well, who came in across and saved us from Walmart was Jeff Bezos, right? just when you thought Walmart was taking over everything. So much for its monopoly, Jeff Bezos. And I'd add one to those truly wealth-creating, values-producing Americans, and that is Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand is and was America's philosopher. Just a very quick background. She emigrated to this country in the 1920s. She spoke very little English, in fact, when she came here originally. And she was educated in Tsarist Russia. Fast forward 70 and 80 years, and Ayn Rand has become one of the most profoundly impactful and philosophically important authors of the modern era, and sold millions and millions of books, still to this day. She sells now more, in fact, more books now, and she's deceased 40 years after her death than she did when she was alive. So Rand came to America. And Rand, I should also point out, transformed philosophy, and I think transformed this country for the best. She came to America to be free to write, and what she immediately saw was that same collectivism that was taking root at the time in Europe was taking hold in America as well. And I'll point out, it's still taking hold in America to this day. We see this continual rise of socialism in America. Her response was Textbook of Americanism. This was going to be her basically every man's guide to understanding what the principles of the country were really about. And it was a series of questions to be published by a group called the Motion Picture Association for the Preservation of American Ideals. And these were some of the big Hollywood stars of the era. People like Walt Disney, Ronald Reagan was among them, Greta Garbo, and Ginger Rogers, Gary Cooper. They essentially commissioned her to write this piece called Textbook of Americanism, explaining for everyone, not the philosophy professor or the very erudite, just every man's understanding of what the country was really about. She proposed 40 plus questions, but only 12 were answered. And the project was abandoned. It was forgotten about until now, because now, thanks to the Ayn Rand Institute, thanks to some of the contributors here on stage, we have a new textbook of Americanism, which finishes, in effect, Rand's unfinished work and completes it and brings her understanding of what this country is about to the public, really for the first time. And it's an important time because the meaning of what the country is about is even more in question, I think, than it was in 1946 when Rand first approached the subject. This is my interpretation of the option we're given now, the supposed choice. These options have converged. The so-called liberals, they've converged, and neither reflect true Americanism. Neither reflect what the country is really all about anywhere in today's political spectrum. Again, individualism. So where do we go from here? What does it mean? Well, Rand starts the book, not with this erudite idea of, well, here's the Medicare system we should have, or here should be the policy on immigration. She starts, what's the basic issue? What is the basic issue in the world today? That's how she starts it, at the beginning. The basic issue in the world today is between individualism and collectivism, she answers. I still think that's the case to this day. Individualism holds that man exists by his own right, for his own sake, not for the sake of the group. Collectivism holds that man has no rights, right? His work, his body, it's all about the group. And we have just a few examples of collectivist societies. Some of these come to mind. You really wouldn't want to have lived or be living under any of these societies. And when you talk about what is really the only truly individualist society in history, America. America is it, and that's what makes us so special. Now, there's a lot that's covered in the book, and we don't have time, obviously, to get into all of it today. But as I said, Rand answered 11 of the questions, and we answer the following. Rand answered those. We answer the rest. And that's on everything from political philosophy to freedom and dictatorship, on foreign policy, very much in the news these days, to this one always gets a lot of response. A philosopher, Harry Binswanger, has an article saying why Buy American is un-American. Pretty novel idea. And, in addition, a wonderful piece by our next speaker, Richard Salsman, who we're just delighted to have here. Richard is a professor, as well as being a market analyst and a widely published author. Richard says that fortunes are made by rational, creative minds operating in a context of freedom. So please help me welcome Richard Salsman to the stage.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, the Heartland Institute, for inviting us. Actually, Jonathan and Amy for just launching this whole project. It seems like many years ago that I was asked. They sent me these questions and they said, do you want to answer any of these? And I wrote back and said, can I answer 48 of them or whatever? And she said, no, you keep it short. So I'll try to do that here today. Now, my focus is going to be on the economics section. And just to give you a flavor of some of the questions that appear under economics, and imagine if you were a student at Duke. I teach at Duke in the PP&E program, which stands for Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. And by the way, very much Ayn Rand's approach to things. You cannot understand capitalism just by looking at the politics of it, or just the economics of it, or just the moral aspects of it. They all have to come together, they all have to be integrated, they all have to make sense, they all have to be consistent. And by the way, the case for anti-capitalism has those three elements too. If you read Karl Marx, it's not just economics, it's politics, it's a moral argument, not a very good one, but the troika of those three disciplines coming together is very powerful. And you want to have them on your side, whatever side you're on. But here's some of the economic questions. What is capitalism? Is capitalism efficient? How are fortunes made under capitalism? I answered that one. Does capitalism create poverty? What's the meaning of the law of supply and demand? Is economic competition beneficial? What is the profit motive? What's the meaning of production for use and not for profit? Would it pay us to divide great fortunes, as in an estate tax? Jonathan answered that one. Are monopolies created by capitalism? Is a mixed economy possible? And finally, can we have planning and freedom at the same time? I might later, if I have time, read an excerpt from that. I wrote that one as well. The idea of whether central planning or planning at all, or is the free market some kind of unplanned, chaotic, spontaneous order type system that we hear from Hayek and others, right? Why is Ayn Rand's case unique? Now imagine Ayn Rand in 1946, she was 41 years old. She's 41 years old. She had been in this country only 20 years, and she had already written The Fountainhead, one of her famous first novels, right? Which has a courtroom speech talking about individualism versus collectivism. So about 3 years later, when she took on this project, it was not as if she had not thought about individual versus collectivism. What she did not think was that it was widely known in the country that that was the basic issue. And I think what's most interesting about these questions she set for herself is how timeless they are. If this is 70 or 80 years ago, and you look at someone who sat down and said, these are the questions that have to be answered if we're going to save this country, right? And we'd just been through World War II. It wasn't obvious that the country was going to remain free and capitalist. Soviet Union still existed, right? The place that she came from. So it kind of depicts the principled nature of this thinker, that they weren't, as Jonathan said, just in the minutia of, Social Security taxes and this and that healthcare system, right? These are the underlying principles that get you to a free economy or an unfree economy. What's her distinctive comparative advantage, as they say in economics? She was one of the first to say capitalism is moral. Capitalism is a moral system. America personifies capitalism. America is one of the few, she said, actually only moral system ever, moral country ever created. And the whole concept of American exceptionalism didn't even exist in 1946. American exceptionalism, it's debated in academia for decades, but the idea of a unique country set up not as a kind of accident of usurpation, but set up as a system of ideas, or a systemization of ideas. You have this idea of individual rights and the rights to life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness. Could that be codified in the institutions of politics? Could that be set up with a system of checks and balances, as the Brits had taught us? It's not like this was out of nowhere. The Brits had taught, John Locke and others, that this was the way to do it, a constitutional system, not a pure democracy. America's not a democracy, was not founded as a democracy. So she's exploring all these kind of things. The question is, I'm going to try to focus on the economics of it. But her distinctive contribution is not simply that capitalism is moral. And here's where it really gets to be a fight amongst us, maybe intramurally. She said, the morality I'm talking about is rational egoism. She says, I don't really think the morality of the opposite, which is sacrifice yourself. Jonathan alluded to this, the idea of altruism, that moral sanctity comes from sacrificing yourself to others, which implies, by the way, that others will sacrifice, that you sacrifice others as well. She said, get rid of sacrifice entirely. Let's stop haggling over victims and seeing who will be the sacrificer and who will do the sacrificing and who will collect these sacrifices. She said, if we can come up with a morality that says no sacrifice at all, win-win relationships, not win-lose, not lose-win, if you want to put it in business terms. But interestingly, she was not the first to mention self-interest. She wasn't even the first to say that self-interest had to do with prosperity. Does anyone know who that was, actually? Aristotle. Wow, I'm impressed. Yeah, a little bit Aristotle. But who's the first one to say the wealth of nations is caused by self-interest? Adam Smith in 1776, not coincidentally the same year as the American Revolution, and Smith says, and he's the father of economics, and says there should be a free economy, but he specifically says the pursuit of self-interest is what actually ultimately leads to the wealth of nations. But what's often forgotten is that in his moral writings, in something called the theory of moral sentiments, he said, I'm not telling you self-interest is moral. It's not. It's practical. See the distinction? It's not really moral. The Bible kind of tells us that the pursuit of money is vicious. So self-interest has this practical benefit of creating the wealth of nations, but we're going to be a little leery of it morally. Ayn Rand said, you don't have to be leery of it morally. Self-interest does not mean running roughshod over others like you're some kind of Nietzschean beast. Self-interest is rationally pursuing your values. Others are included in those values. So it's not like you're an isolated atomistic being on some desert. It's these mutually beneficial, mutually self-interested relationships that are crucial to capitalism. This is what capitalism celebrates. This is what capitalism institutionalizes. That's what she's defending. But notice you would have, from this view, enemies or critics, even from within the free market movement, who would say, what are you saying? Are you getting rid of faith and religion? Yes, she said, yes, actually, I don't think that's a very good basis for capitalism. Capitalism, she said, on a very basic level, relies on reason and rationality, as opposed to any kind of form of unreason. Going up the next level, she said the case for capitalism is egoism. What's the alternative to that? Altruism. Going up another level, she said capitalism depends on individualism. What's the counter to that? Collectivism. Going up one step further, capitalism depends on rights. What's the opposite of rights? Duties. And finally, the politics. You see how it's worked? There's a whole structure to this argument. The last level is government has to be constitutionally limited, not, what's the opposite? This unlimited majoritarianism, that whatever the general will wants, they should get. Whatever the majority votes for, they should get, even if they vote away the rights of others. Right? She's rejecting all that. So one way of looking at this is there's a menu of choice you can have to defend the free society. There's a conservative approach to this. There's a libertarian approach to this. There's an objectivist approach to this. Is there some overlap or mutual support between them? Yes, but this is a distinctive view. We shouldn't be shy about saying it's a distinctive view. We should learn from each other about what the better or weaker views are. That's the main point I wanted to bring here. Here's another way Ayn Rand would put it. If capitalism is perishing, and if it's facing this return to socialism, it's not because people don't know economics. And her way of putting it was, you can read Hayek, you can read Mises, you can read Smith, you can read Hazlitt, you'll learn a lot about economics, but that's not why people are anti-capitalist. She doesn't really think at root economic ignorance is the source of the animosity toward capitalism. She says the animosity toward capitalism is people are uncomfortable with its underlying ethic. They're uncomfortable defending rational egoism. For whatever the reasons are, that's the key issue. See the idea? So it's not like she dismissed economics. She said it's important. It's important to know how capitalism actually works out in practical form. But a much deeper, more important thing is the morality. Now get this. Here's how a college student would put it, because I hear it all the time. Socialism doesn't work. I grant that socialism usually wrecks the economy, but it's just. It's moral. See the dichotomy there? Someone who's willing to admit that it is a disaster. Look at Venezuela. It's a disaster, but what would they say, especially when people were voting for that down in Caracas? That it's a social justice issue. It's a more just society to be more egalitarian. It's a more just society to expropriate wealth from the evil capitalists. Right? So they were making a moral argument. They were not standing up in Caracas saying the nationalization of industry and price controls will bring us prosperity. Almost none of them said that. They said it will bring a more just society. And now they can just barely eat. And they're eating their own pets. So practicality can only take you so far. And that's coming from me, who's trained as an economist. I'm aware enough to know that the moral and political arguments are important. A couple other points, and then I'll read an excerpt. Just to give you a flavor, because we were interviewed earlier, and someone said, oh my God, it has textbook in the name. I don't really want to read a textbook. It's not a textbook in the sense of these boring, voluminous things you get, or used to get, in college, that you're, trudging through. It's a fairly thin book, if you think about it. And if there's 40 or so questions in here, they have a couple pages each. Really essentialized, really condensed, really easy to read. I would say easy to read. So it's not something you have to trudge through like a textbook in Econ 101 or something like that. Just a quick point on trends today. The president said, before he was president, he was asked, do you think America is exceptional? Hillary Clinton was asked this, actually, and she said yes. She didn't say quite why, but when he was asked, he said, no, I don't like talking about America that way. I don't think America is exceptional. And you remember Obama said, oh, you ask anybody from any country, they'll think their own country is exceptional. So that was revealing that Donald Trump didn't really believe in this concept of American exceptionalism, let alone how to define it. But there's another interesting thing he said more recently as president. So as in the State of the Union back in January. Remember the famous phrase? America will never become a socialist country. Remember? And here's my point, and maybe the point, not to speak for Ayn Rand, but she might say, why wouldn't the president say America should become a capitalist country? You see the difference? It's subtle maybe, but to be against socialism isn't enough, right? You need to be for something. To beat a bad idea, you have to have a better idea. So it's nice to defensively say we shouldn't have socialism. And yet there seems to be a sweep toward socialism, at least from some side. And from the other side, there isn't really a case for capitalism. On the conservative Republican side, right, there's a case for the mixed economy. Trump did not run on reforming anything having to do with the welfare state. He was going to preserve all that. And the national debt is just as completely out of control as it was, even though the economy's in the 9th year of expansion. So there's no one really advocating or pushing for capitalism. And as long as there's that kind of defensiveness, a defensiveness ultimately I think that comes from this uncertainty and guilt about pushing the egoistic, individualistic, rights-based argument, you're going to drift toward socialism or some bad version of it. Now, if you know the terminology of history, here's another thing I notice, which is what one of the great authors in objectivism called the ominous parallels. The Dr. Leonard Peikoff in 1982 wrote the ominous parallels, and the parallels he was drawing was between modern-day America and Weimar Germany, which is Germany pre-Hitler. Why would he make such a connection? I thought we were moving towards socialism, not fascism. Fascism is government control of the economy, but you can continue to own property and own the means of production. Socialism says the government's going to own the means of production. Hitler said, I don't need to own the means of production. I need to own people. I don't need to socialize investment. I need to socialize people. Let them own things, but I'll tell them what to do with those things. Well, I think it's very ominous that if you look today, you have one side pushing nationalism, right? That's Trump. Nationalism, not individualism. The idea that the nation state is above and beyond the individual. So nationalism from the right, socialism from the left. If you put national socialism together, the contraction is Nazism. That's what Nazism means. It's national socialism. It's two groups in Weimar Germany allegedly fighting with each other about what the future of Germany should be. And one side said we should be nationalists. And the other side said you would be socialists. And Hitler showed up and said, you're both right. Let's have both. This is what Leonard Peikoff documents in The Ominous Parallels. It's quite ominous to see nationalism and socialism being advocated in America today, but not capitalism. All right, let me just read an excerpt just to give you a flavor of how some of these questions are answered. Now, here's the one on that I particularly wrote on, can we have planning and freedom at the same time? So this is Ayn Rand's question, not mine. And I puzzled over this one, and I knew how I was going to write it, but then I worked on it, and this is the answer I came up with. Can we have planning and freedom at the same time? So I write, yes, if by planning means individuals and associations they form, like corporations, left free by government to design and execute their life projects and business plans, to pursue their happiness as they alone see fit. Consider the plethora of private planning undertaken by a variety of people for an array of purposes, and undertaken more effectively the more the government actually respects rights. We observe career planning, business planning, retirement planning, estate planning. We see wedding plans, nutrition plans, medical treatment plans, vacation plans. The more freedom exists, the more such planning occurs. It's as absurd for socialists to caricature capitalism as an unplanned anarchy as it is for anarchists to claim that capitalism delivers some semi-mystical spontaneous order devoid of human design. If some company or people refuse to plan or simply fail in the plans they pursue, the just government does not intervene on their behalf with handouts and bailouts, secured necessarily by defunding and wrecking the successful plans of others. Since no one's omniscient, failures will occur, but this only confirms the value of a commitment to sound planning. Meanwhile, capitalist citizens are left free to choose to mitigate others' failures by voluntary private charity. Freedom under capitalism is best assured if planning also includes, as it must, a resolute commitment by government to administer its own legitimate affairs in a rational, transparent manner. Since government's sole purpose is to protect individual rights from violation by the initiation of force or fraud, whether at home or abroad, the just government must provide the police, courts, and national defense. And in so doing, it must protect and provide the necessary administrative infrastructure and financial wherewithal, being sure to maintain the integrity and sustainability of the public finances. Proper political governance requires careful planning, honest budgeting, fair taxing. It eschews profligacy, chicanery, or fraud in the fiscal affairs. It also, as well, wasteful spending, embezzlement, counterfeiting, punitive taxation, or defaults on the public debt. The main advantage flowing from the rational, honest, and fiscally sound political governance is the provision of a just and predictable context for planning by individuals. The understandable suspicion among the friends of capitalism that there cannot be planning and freedom simultaneously actually reflects the history of the abject failures and horrors of central planning. The sordid record includes monetary debasement, wage and price controls, punitive taxation, nationalization of industry, bailouts of political cronies, subsidies for reckless behavior, debt defaults, trust busting, propagandistic schools, pyramid schemes veiled as social security, protectionism, socialized medicine, conscription, and disastrous military ventures. If this is the meaning attached to planning, then without question, planning is antithetical to freedom. And to conclude, I say, such central planning could not be made to succeed were it instead decentralized planning. State and local governments, Illinois knows this, can inflict at least as much direct harm. Is this state bankrupt yet, Illinois? It's getting there. All right, so it isn't just Washington, right? There's a swamp here. The real problem and evil with central planning is that it's government coercion initiated against innocent individuals and firms, which deprives them of their life, liberty, property, and sanity. This is the planning that undermines and sabotages all truly rational plans. So central planning, in truth, is best comprehended as both legalized and organized crime. It's inimical to human freedom, the freedom to think, to plan, to choose, to act according to one's plan, to prosper, to live. I'll leave it at that. And now, Jonathan. Is that my payment?
Thank you very much, Richard. And next we'll bring up Amy Peikoff, who I know is also familiar to many of you. Ooh, let's go back to Amy Peikoff as well. Amy's a frequent guest for Tammy Bruce. She is a frequent guest on The Tucker Show. She's the host of her own very widely regarded podcast called Don't Let It Go. And she wrote about civil rights and racial prejudice in the book. So please welcome Amy.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Heartland, for having us. And thanks to everyone for coming tonight. I'm going to do something a little bit different. What I would like to do is put this project, a new textbook of Americanism, in the context of my overall work, the work that I sort of stumbled into 9 years ago when I started my blog. My blog is called Don't Let It Go. So it's don'tletitgo.com. That was my advertising. But the it in Don't Let It Go is something called the American Sense of Life. The title, Don't Let It Go, is from an essay written by Ayn Rand, and it's in this collection, Philosophy Who Needs It. She wrote it in 1971. And the American Sense of Life, she wrote in this essay, she thought that this American sense of life, which I'll tell you what she meant by that in a second, she thought it saves us from dictatorship, that it is the thing that saves us from dictatorship, from totalitarianism. So what is it? If you go to page 205 of the book, she says, a sense of life is, I'm going to skip the very abstract language, okay? But she says, a sense of life is an emotional, subconsciously integrated appraisal of man and of existence. It represents an individual's unidentified philosophy. Now that was still sort of abstract. You didn't even see what I skipped. But the way that I gloss that is I say that what it is, it's an attitude that Americans come at life with a unique attitude that could be contrasted with the attitude of Europeans. And in the essay, she goes on to talk about what I would call a constellation of various attitudes that she says Americans uniquely possess, and she contrasts them at different places with the attitudes that Europeans possess. And she says that this constellation of attitudes taken together has been the thing that has protected Americans from totalitarianism, from dictatorship. And again, she was writing in 1971. So when you look at this essay, one of the useful exercises is to say, do Americans really possess this constellation of attitudes today? Which ones, et cetera? And I'm going to go through a number of them in a minute. But so she lays them all out because she says that's really the best way to explain what she means by the American sense of life, just give you the examples of the various attitudes that she observes from her perspective coming from Soviet Russia. And then she goes on to say that having those attitudes, which again are just philosophy held implicitly, it's not enough. What you need to do is you need to make the ideas behind these attitudes explicit. And so that's what I see this book that Jonathan was the instigator of playing a crucial role in making these ideas explicit to a large audience. Again, because while the name textbook is there, it's in, I think, a highly digestible form. I'm going to add one little tip. The podcast was a great warm-up, by the way. Thanks, Jim, for that. But one thing that occurred to me is if you're reading in here, I would suggest diving into the issue that is on your mind, that you saw in the newspaper and you're really upset about, something that you care about, you were talking about with your family member and you want to be clear on, something, don't necessarily read cover to cover, do the pick and choose. I always think that when you come at ideas from a perspective of something that you care about in your daily life, you're just going to get so much more value out of your exploration of the idea. So I think this book can go a long way to making the American sense of life, this attitude that Americans uniquely have, how we come at the world, come at life, and make those ideas explicit so that the attitude can endure over the long term and continue to protect us from totalitarianism. For me, when I stumbled upon this idea of don't let it go, I was very interested in, of course, preventing dictatorship, preventing totalitarianism in our country. And also just personally, when I was reading this essay, I was saying, sometimes I personally can struggle with maintaining certain of the attitudes. And that could be because I grew up last several decades or whatever, and I have witnessed some of the decline in American culture. I am a product of government schools, like so many of us are. So I also just found it sort of personally interesting to focus on this constellation of attitudes in all of the commentary that I've done over the years in any of the different fora that I've been invited. And I've found that it has helped me in my own personal development too. So with that said, let's talk about some of the ideas, because then what I want to do, which I think is a fun exercise, is tie some of the attitudes that Rand talks about in this essay to some of the explicit ideas in the textbook, and in particular looking at the section that I was assigned on racism, property rights, civil rights. And I want to dive a little bit into principle, which is Leonard Peikoff's, but I'll do a little stealing if that's okay. So what do we mean by an American sense of life? What sort of constellation of attitudes does she have in mind? First of all, she says, Americans see themselves as independent entities. We see ourselves as being independent, whereas a European, by contrast, would more readily see himself as belonging to the state. Americans, she say, don't allow themselves to be pushed around, maybe the way Europeans do. Does that seem to ring true? And again, you can think 1971 versus today. What sort of state are we in today? Second, she says that money earned by someone's own personal effort is admired in America, whereas in Europe, it's sort of the old money, or the money that's in the church or in royalty that's respected. But in the United States, we respect achievement. We respect money earned by one's own personal effort. What'd you say? The self-made man, yes. We respect that here in America. We also have respect for our public figures, but in America, it's a respect sort of among equals. And in a way, a lot of people criticize Trump for tweeting, and I criticize the content of Trump's tweets all the time. But one thing that I've said that is actually a good thing about Trump tweeting is that he's publicly accessible, right? So I feel like I can go out there and answer Trump in the morning with my coffee and get mad, or mostly mad. Sorry, guys. Okay. Well, and yeah, so I do a little bit of detection and kind of translation and deciphering of those tweets, right? The one that Jonathan did, I would have rewritten it about the same way that he did, right? So and that was a recent one too. You think that, yeah. But no, I mean, you see that though, right? That something very American is to be able to tweet to Donald Trump, to tweet to Kanye West and everything else, and think that you are a person who can talk to and criticize these figures. So that's one thing I think Rand would have liked on today's scene, because that is it. We respect our public figures, but as equals. Americans reject, and Jonathan talked about this a little in his presentation, the whole idea of being born into a certain class or a certain caste or with a certain skin color, etc., that would limit where you could go with your life. Whereas Americans, she says, are not limited by those ideas, and Americans uniquely exhibit initiative, is the way that she put it explicitly. That an American, if they're at a workplace and they see a problem, they say, hey, I don't care what job title I have or how long I've been here or whatever. If I see the solution, I'm going to dive in and offer it and, really just stick my neck out for the thing that's right, that's actually going to solve this problem. Whereas apparently, Rand observed, in European workplaces and British workplaces, people would more just stick to whatever their little job title is and try to not get into trouble, even if potentially if they looked at the problem that's in another department, they could solve it. Something else she observed, and this is really where I like to focus more. Americans, she said, believed in the potential for human happiness on this earth in this life. They embraced the pursuit of happiness. I mean, we have it in our founding document, but that they really did exhibit and live this attitude. And again, you might compare 1971 to now. You might compare, I've heard many stories about the sense of life at the turn of the 19th to 20th century versus today, that it was quite different. But this is maybe a temperature-taking exercise that you can do about the health of sense of life in America, a big one. To what extent do Americans believe that human beings are capable of pursuing happiness for themselves in this life on earth? Another way to put it, the Badger Clark poem, is the world something, the world for you, something that begins when you're born, and is the world something for you to win, to make your own world in which you can be happy. Europeans, she thought, believed in the idea of original sin, that somehow based on characteristics you were born with, there was something bad about you that made you unworthy of success and happiness in this earth, and Americans reject that. Americans also, she observed, and this is one of my favorite quotations from her, have a healthy attitude of defiance. She said, defiance, not obedience, is the American's answer to overwhelming authority. That is a uniquely American response. So as I listed all of those various attributes and characteristics, do you think she was on the right track? Yeah? So, and do you, I mean, again, we're sitting here in 2019. Do you feel that these attitudes are still alive and healthy today, and that it does uniquely distinguish Americans from Europeans, for example? No? You're shaking your head no? Hell no. So what, do you think we have moved more towards the European attitudes? Which in particular?
I feel we totally moved towards the European attitude. I mean, look at Illinois. It's a complete disaster. We keep electing these people. We elected...
So, but which one in particular would really, when you say, gosh, we really don't exhibit that attitude today?
I love everything you're saying, and I'd like to be optimistic. I've got a son graduating college in a couple of weeks, but the bottom line is when Ayn Rand talked about Americans, she talked about the greatest generation, which won World War II.
Okay.
That generation has been
So you...
gone, and the communists are like...
So you're gonna say all of these attitudes, and we'll save more back and forth. We'll save more back and forth. Well, okay. So you say this is the old America, and that there has been a severe deterioration in these attitudes today. I've seen pockets of this. So I think, for example, Silicon Valley, right? If you look at Silicon Valley, which is one of the least regulated sectors of our economy, you have a bunch of people who believe that they're able to go out and make happy lives for themselves, producing wonderful products that are going to hopefully make other people's lives happier. That, you know, a Steve Jobs feels that he can create a product that he himself would want to play with, and that it's going to not only make him a lot of money, but improve the lives of everyone. In that sector, when I look at those innovators, you know, when they're not being hauled before Congress these days, which is what happens, right? But, you know, they have a vision of making the world a better place and making themselves happy in the process. Yes.
When
So, I mean, there's going to be all kinds of different ways, but this is probably a discussion for the Q&A period that we want to do. But I think that there is a lot in terms of the ethics. You know, that this book is more focused on politics. But I think that there's two things. As I said, I just said that they're the least regulated, one of the least regulated sectors. The fact that they are routinely able to act according to their own judgment and witness the results and experience the benefit of the results, and then go on to use the money to donate to, you know, further their own values. So for example, you and I are going to probably disagree with the content of the curriculum that Mark Zuckerberg and his wife have put together, right? There's some kind of I forget what it's called, Summit, is that right? The high-tech curriculum. It was in the New York Times recently, and I was noting that on social media. But the idea of using technology to make an individually tailored education available more broadly and more cheaply to tons of students, it's a wonderful, very value-oriented idea. So can you imagine, you make Facebook, you make a ton of money, you get people more connected. I think Zuckerberg is earnest in what he's trying to pursue. I think I disagree a lot with him on politics. I'm very disappointed, and I criticize Facebook on Facebook all the time. But I think he's very earnest, very productive, very value-oriented. And, you know, being able to be free to act according to your own judgment, to produce wonderful things that improve people's lives and see the results and get rich, and then be able to take the money that you earn and further other values of you, like you say, I have this vision to improve education. Imagine how happy you'd be, right? But there's a lot of people who are, unfortunately, mired in areas that are a lot more regulated, where they're not able to have that experience. And increasingly, we might see that Silicon Valley, tech tyranny, sorry Tucker, is going to come under more and more regulation, and we're not going to see as much productivity and as much benevolence and happiness and exuberance from these tech giants. They're going to become beleaguered as well. This isn't the Q&A. I'm so sorry I started this, but I love having feedback. I'm a natural kind of teacher, and I like to, at a certain point, go to the audience too. But so one thing I would like to do is say, okay, I agree, at least in certain aspects, we have seen a deterioration and erosion in the American sense of life. And so then what is the answer? Rand said, and I tend to agree, that we need to make the ideas behind this sense of life explicit, okay? And we need to be able to teach them to the next generations as well, something that becomes more and more of a challenge with the type of education that is in our government schools, which do have a monopoly, right? So I think that's the big challenge. Let me give you just a couple ideas. How am I doing on time, by the way? Because I'm okay. I just want to talk about a couple ideas, because one of the topics that I got to address in this book is racism. Why racism is un-American. And I don't know that I need to belabor it for this audience. One observation that I'll make, but I'll give you the essence. Racism is un-American because it involves judging people according to characteristics over which they have no voluntary control, and also it's a characteristic, race, skin color, that is completely irrelevant to a person's productivity, intelligence, entrepreneurship, talent, good character, etc. In America, we judge people as individuals, and we reward them according to their good attributes. And race, skin color, is just a completely irrelevant characteristic. So it's un-American. One thing that is interesting, and you might say, okay, well, this is a little bit good. Discourse out there on Twitter is horrible. Who's on Twitter? It's terrible. One of the things that everyone has talked about is that the accusation of someone being racist just comes out right away. Why do you think it is? It's because they know it is a bad thing. It's a very un-American thing to be racist. Now, I think the accusation is thrown out too lightly and stuff, but the fact that they chose it, it shows you. But suppose you have this racist attitude that you're going to judge people according to race. how would that sort of interplay with the attitudes, the list of attitudes that I read to you guys? So for example, in particular, I said that Rand observed in Europe, they were still wedded to sort of a class system or a caste system. Racism is still a creature, a leftover from that you say the skin color that someone is born with is going to limit what that person can do with life. Here, let me show you some statistics, QED. And it's completely wrong. There is no cause and effect relationship. And again, what does the American say? The American says, if I'm there and I have the ability to see a solution to a problem at my place of work or somewhere out in the world, something, I am going to take the initiative. Jonathan's going to take the initiative and make this book, right? You're not going to say, Jonathan's not going to say, hey, I didn't get a philosophy PhD. What about, this is about philosophy. No, you say, this problem needs to be solved. I'm going to do it. And that's what we as Americans do. So racism is going to interfere with that. Racism, of course, is you've seen Americans as independent entities. Are you going to see yourself as an independent entity, or are you going to see yourself as a member of your race, and then start viewing everybody as some sort of a intergroup warfare dynamic? Is there some sort of original sin conception as well? So you can see how some of these attitudes are going to interfere. Property rights. I talked about property rights in this book, and I heavily cribbed in my little section on why property rights are necessary for the exercise of all our rights. I heavily cribbed from Onkar Ghate, who just gave this great podcast presentation tying property rights to the exercise of our right to liberty and the exercise of our right to the pursuit of happiness. Imagine we're in a society now where property rights are not respected. One of the types of examples that I'm hearing all the time from some of my friends, they work in these sort of free market public interest law firm settings like a Pacific Legal Foundation, and time and again somebody purchases a piece of land and they have this vision of what they want to do to make this beautiful home for themselves, a place that they can invite family members and have great vacations and things like this. And the government steps in and tells them they cannot do what they want to do with their land. And there's decades-long battles in the courts and so much money spent, and I can only imagine the pain that they must go through. Imagine, again, I mean, right now, Mark Zuckerberg. It would be interesting to me to look at, when he was in the early days of Facebook, before the FTC and Congress and everybody else started trying to get their hooks into him. If you could just look at pictures and say, what does the attitude on his face look like in terms of his ability to go out and produce great values and create a happy life for himself and help other people, which is something that he genuinely wants to do, versus today. He's going to have that sort of beleaguered attitude. And why is it his property rights are not being respected? The most recent thing, I don't even know, has the news come out? Has the FTC come out with its latest settlement with Facebook yet? They are going to now have a committee that's part government and part Facebook people to oversee the privacy policy of all Facebook. They're saying, sorry, Mark Zuckerberg, you do not control your property 100% anymore. And it's not, oh, well, you committed this act of fraud, and so we're going to sue you, declare a judgment, and have you pay a fine. They don't want just even the payment of money, which in and of itself, if all you're doing is exercising your property rights, is not right. They go a step further and they say, we are now going to have a government representative partly in control of what you can do with what is nominally your property. Fascism, anybody? Yeah. So property rights are rights that must be respected 100%, I would say, for somebody to say that I feel I can go out there, choose my values, pursue them, earn them, keep them, dispose of them in order to create the ideal vision for my life, so long as I'm not violating anybody else's rights. We cannot do that in our country today. And one thing that I think is so important in today's context, especially where I'm sure many of you in the room are sympathetic with the idea of regulating Facebook. People are very sympathetic with this. We need to say no. You know, Mark Zuckerberg, I do not agree with what you're doing. I'm going to criticize your implementation of your terms of service, the content of your terms of service, whatever. But I am going to adhere to the principle of private property rights. So long as you are using and disposing of your private property without infringing anybody else's rights, and nobody else has a right to a platform, then we're gonna let you be. We're gonna maybe contribute to a startup that's a competing startup. But I think we need to have 100% buy-in to the principle of property rights. And again, I would urge you to read the essay, heavily cribbed from Onkar, who's brilliant, as to why liberty, freedom of association, freedom of speech, the pursuit of happiness is intimately tied with property rights. And certainly that is going to affect people's subconscious attitudes about them being able to create their best vision for their own life. So that is a couple examples, and I think I've much overstayed my time, but let's all join in the effort to make these ideas explicit in the culture and save that American sense of life.
Thank you very much, Amy. I want to talk very briefly before we finish on one more quick issue that was brought up, and that is nationalism, because you hear it a lot, and Rand actually foresaw this issue becoming pretty important in America. Trump, we know, has talked quite a bit about being a nationalist, and Yaron Brook has a wonderful essay in the book. Nationalism essentially means my country right or wrong. Rand said my country if it has the right ideas. So nationalism and authoritarianism are the antithesis of what Rand talks about. She talks about the individual as a right to his own life, his own freedom, not as a servant to the public good or to the country. I mean, of course, we've talked about that quite a bit on Fox over the years in terms of the growth of statism and the growth of nationalism as well. So, well, actually, let's skip ahead, AV guy. We have textbooks. But now we have a textbook that matters, and it matters more than any time, I think, in our past, because we've been talking about the move towards socialism, the move towards collectivism is just getting bigger and bigger in this country. So we need to get rid of that, and we have the tool now. It is a new textbook of Americanism, and America needs it more than anyone. America needs Americanism. This country is based on individualism. Neither party reflects it now. So thank you for espousing those ideas in your own lives, for supporting them through the Heartland Institute, and most of all for being with us here tonight. So we'll take your Q&A, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Oh,
great.
sure, please.
So why don't you stay there?
No, sure.
And you guys can share that microphone that I just turned on the table. So if you have a question, and I'm sure there might be one or two, please put your hand up, and Lindsay will come over to you with the microphone. And we'll start right here with Jack. Oh, can you please identify yourself so that we know
Sure.
who to speak to?
I'm a capitalist. Right. You don't want to eat the mic. You got to be a certain part away from it, right? Otherwise, you get feedback like that. I'm Jack McInerney. I was at the start of the Heartland in the 1980s in its original office in LaSalle. Anyway, I'm that old. Zoning. A lot of libertarians complain about zoning. How much zoning in your philosophy would you allow? Should there be certain restrictions around schools, churches, or do I have a right to pollute my neighbor?
Well, first of all, actually, I'll give you a little something. For anyone who asks a question, you know, you said you were an American capitalist, so I have just the shirt for you. Well, the problem is now is that you have a target on your back these days. So I'll just, Richard, you want to jump in on that one? Do you have the?
As to zoning, to the extent you have a government board telling people what to do with their property, that is improper. But the concept you raised, the idea of, well, what about industrial districts, school districts, residential districts? The fact that people recognize those different uses and prefer to live in those kind of separated uses, so to speak, to me is something settled entirely by the free market. I mean, you would gravitate toward the areas you want to live. If it's more or less industrial, you know that going in. You also know that capitalism is not a status quo system, that it will never change once you get into the neighborhood, right? And if it changes in a way that you don't like, you leave the neighborhood. There's mobility under capitalism. No one has a right to remain in some fixed position, right? But the concept you raised of what about polluting others? If you violate other people's rights, that's a tort. That's a tort handled under capitalism. Capitalism is not anarchy. Capitalism is a system of objective laws, which would include tort just meaning a wrong. If a wrong is done to you, either to person or property, that's handled in the courts. Restitution is required. Sometimes you can preempt such harms. But zoning is, I would put it this way, zoning is a kind of central planning or government planning that presumes in advance what people should do with their property. And that's just not what government's role should be. Government's role should be to come in after people contract their property in various ways and protect those contracts and don't allow torts, or at least have torts that are handled with restitution. That's the way I'd have answered it. Did you want to add or subtract? Okay.
We have a question right over here.
I'm Bob Angelica. I just have a brief reading suggestion. It's called The Prize. Mark Zuckerberg, in case you forgot, a few years ago, donated $100 million to the Newark, New Jersey public schools. The mayor of Newark at the time was a fellow named Cory Booker. You heard of him? It's an interesting book to read as to what happened to the $100 million and the leadership of Mr. Booker, Senator Booker, who's now running for president. That's it.
Definitely take it under advisement. Thank you. Oh. Sorry.
I was right there. Where's this going?
Oh no! It was.
We'll find a home for it.
James. So, Richard, you nailed it on the head during your presentation, so I wondered if you might be able to elaborate on it a little bit more. The stepping up from, you kind of contrasted a reason epistemology with mysticism epistemology, and then how that extends up into ethics and politics and gets to what we're talking about. Can you elaborate on that for some folks who may not be as familiar with Rand's idea behind that?
On the structure or on the opposition to reason?
Within the structure of philosophy and how it builds from epistemology to ethics to politics, and then how you made that contrast, because that was beautiful.
That's a big question.
Yeah.
And before I answer it, the best source for this would be to actually read Dr. Leonard Peikoff's book, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. So he goes through the whole structure. But the idea is that the best argument for capitalism goes something like this. You need to be for reason. Rationality, reason is the main faculty that distinguishes us from animals. All right, so if you don't want an animalistic system like socialism or fascism, truly animalistic systems, if you want a truly humane system, it has to be based on the thing that makes humans distinctive, reason, the faculty of reason. And there's many ways to be anti-reason, which I won't go into, but that's the base. I want to stay positive here. That's the basic argument. So first you're for reason, then you're for your own life, not to the cost of others' lives, and that's the egoism part. So you use your mind to advance your life, right? So now we have epistemology as reason, egoism is the ethics. What's next? Individualism. You need to be an individual. You need to be an independent person who deals with other people not as a parasite, but as an independent human being, independent in thought, independent materially. Got to get your own job. You can't be a ward of the state on the dole, right? That's what so individualism, the idea of thinking for yourself, producing for yourself, trading with others. The opposite is collectivism. You go a step further, and that has to be codified in a system. There's no anarchy here. Capitalism is advocating a system that protects the rational, egoistic, individualist, and so they can live because they have rights. The only way to protect that kind of person is to acknowledge that they have rights to the kind we're talking about, to life, liberty, right? Not the right to rob others. because that's anti-rights. And then I think the last thing I mentioned was, if you bring in the politics of it, capitalism basically has to be in a government of constitutionalism. I use that broadly just to mean a document that limits the government that to a few powers that are legitimate powers. And usually the counter to that, and the reason you have an anti-constitutional movement today, by the way, people who say, the heck with the Constitution. The reason they say the heck with the Constitution is they do not want limited government. They want unlimited Rousseauian majority rule. Whatever the general will wants, they get, and to heck with anybody else's liberties and rights. So on every level, that whole hierarchical argument, you see how there's a lot there. You can't just come out and say, I'm for liberty. Are you for liberty too? I guess we're all for liberty. This will be great. You can have an eclectic hash of arguments for liberty that conflict with each other, that are easily thrown off and easily refuted. I mean, you can refute some of these arguments in no time if anyone rejects reason, rejects egoism, rejects individualism. If they try to defend liberty while rejecting all its understructure, it's going to collapse. It's not going to work. Does that help? Okay, you're welcome. Thank you.
All right, we have one over here, and we have two here. We might have time for those. Here we go.
Hi, Bill Bergman. How American, and the idea, this American idea, how American is the American banking system today?
Well, I again will defer to Richard, but I'll say anything but. I mean, in the sense that I'll just sweep briefly in that, just look at 2008 as the best example. People will tell you that, the financial crisis in 2008 was caused by this unregulated financial system of Wall Street run wild, greed on Wall Street, and unregulated finances. Banking is the most regulated sector in the economy. I think it's one of the reasons why you've seen so little advancement in as against other elements of technology in the economy. So this notion that banking is unregulated and we need to crack down, it's the opposite of what the reality is. And I know Richard, you could, and Amy as well, but Richard, you could follow up on that probably in even greater detail.
I would just say briefly, because I've written on this, and Bill, it's great to see you here. The U.S. banking system has been co-opted in a way by the central banking system. So we didn't have a central bank in the U.S. until 1913. So not to go into a big history lesson, but the fact that the country could survive and prosper for 140 years without a central bank shows you that a central bank isn't necessary. Then the question is, so why does it exist? If it doesn't exist due to market failure, due to the failure of the gold standard in the free banking system, what does it exist for? In all my writings, what I basically show is that it's not there to fix banking failure in the free market. It's there to fund profligate government. The purpose of central banks is to facilitate deficit spending. And now as long as you know that, as long as it interacts with the private banking system, it is going to corrupt and undermine the private banking system. So when you see recklessness on Wall Street, when you see people taking risks and then dumping it off on the taxpayers with bailouts or deposit insurance, that is not a free market monetary system. But it is a system that the Federal Reserve very much, and any central bank really, it's not just the Fed, wants to have because it needs to co-opt the money and banking system. And the only reason it needs to co-opt the money and banking system is it literally cannot tax people enough to support the welfare state. That's why there's massive deficit spending. If they tax people to the full tilt, to the full extent of what the spending is, there would be riots. There would be tax revolts. I mean, there have been tax revolts. So one way around this is to say, well, how do we do deficit spending? You do it by a central banking system. It's ultimately going to corrupt the private banking system. That's the real issue. But I like Jonathan's point. It is sad to see these crises blamed on, well, there's still too much freedom in the banking system. There's still some vestiges left over of some, let's extinguish all of it. That's such a sad answer because as in healthcare and schooling and elsewhere, the problems are the intervention, not the fact that all freedom hasn't been extinguished from the field.
Got one right back here. Sir, your name?
My name's Mike, and I go to Heartland events once in a while. I bought the book, and I plan on reading it. I flipped through Yaron Brooks' short statement on nationalism, and I suspect he may miss a point on it, or maybe I don't get his point on it. I consider myself a pro-freedom person, but I consider myself a supporter of the nation state. And essentially, if you look at some of the nationalism that's come about the past couple of years, a lot of it is done as response to globalism and various forms of global government. And I meant that some forms of nationalism can be authoritarian, but I'll say that a defense of the nation state is not necessarily contradictory towards a defense of individual freedom.
I'll answer quickly, and Amy, if you wanted to jump into as well. I mean, my quick response, and of course I don't speak for Ayn Rand, but she would, I think, say, well, when we talk about, then what is the nation? The nation is a country of individuals. So when you talk about protecting the nation state, what you're really talking about is protecting each individual's right to his or her own life. We talked about that ad infinitum tonight. And just as an example, kind of ripped from the headlines example of how nationalism ultimately plays out is, well, tariffs is the best example. I mean, if you bought a washing machine in the last year and a half, you paid something like $70 to $100 more because of the tariffs placed on those imported washing machines for the so-called nation. So what you have is the interest of people who just simply want to buy a washing machine and not spend more than they have to, being sacrificed for the so-called greater good of American washing machine manufacturers. That, I think, for me, and I think for Rand, is just the antithesis of America. America doesn't say sacrifice yourself, pay more than you have to for the so-called nation. America says go out, buy what you want, at the price you want, unencumbered by government force. And if your neighbor can't compete, if your neighbor has to get a job, then that's exactly what they do. And the history has never been the loss of American jobs or the extinction of American jobs, but more and more jobs created. Globalism is kind of a slur term these days, and I know it's a big tent term that means a lot of things, but if by globalism you mean global trade, that's been nothing but an immense benefit for all Americans up and down the line, no one more than the lowest income Americans who save all that money by buying foreign produced goods. So I'm proudly a globalist in the sense that I'm a free trader and believe in free trade, and this notion of sacrificing yourself for the nation, I think, is actually the antithesis. So I urge you to read the rest of the essay, and I think hopefully it'll be illuminating for you as well. But my attitude is that there should be two ways we either approach a country: with free, unrestricted trade, or we're at war with them. I don't see a purpose of having government decide. I mean, now our government, Trump is negotiating what should be the labor regulations and wages of workers in Mexico. Not even setting wages of workers here in America, but workers in Mexico. So absolutely, I think the trade deal should be freedom for Americans to buy what they want at the price they want from anywhere in the world they want, providing that country isn't an enemy of the United States. Yeah. Or if Amy, if you have any, you want to.
The only thing I was going to add is to understand Yaron's view on nationalism or the nation state. You would ask this question, you'd say, when is a nation state of value to me? Right? So such that I want to support a particular nation state. And it's going to depend on, and we're talking about a government then, right? It's going to depend on what principles the government is run on, what it's limited by, and really only a government that is restricted to the protection of individual rights of citizens is a value to you. Any government that goes beyond that and decides, okay, they're going to redistribute wealth and they're going to regulate this and zone that and I'm not for that nation state. I'm for the nation state insofar as it is a protector of my rights, because then it is actually furthering my value pursuit in life, my pursuit of happiness.
Let me just add briefly, on 116 and 117 of the book, she defends the nation state. So Ayn Rand was not against the nation state. That question she posed for herself was, should Americans support one world government? Her answer is no. But her answer is because you're more likely to risk your liberties with a one world government. But in that answer, if you want to look at it, she says she makes a case basically for the nation state. But as Amy said, a nation state that does not, national is, when you attach an ism to it, it's a state that subordinates the individual to the nation. That's what she opposed, but not the nation state itself. By the way, this is similar to her argument against libertarians. She says we can have a government that protects individual rights. We can have it obey an objective moral code. Libertarians don't believe that. They equate the state with statism. She doesn't. She says statism's common. She says, but let's have a state that is not statist. So equivalently, she's saying, let's have a nation state which is not nationalist. See the distinction?
One more thing on the rejection of one world government. And it reminds me that in the what do you call it, an appendix or something, where she did the Q&A that has been published in this volume for the first time. Yep. kudos.
Yeah, absolutely. There's unpublished work by Ayn Rand, as Amy said, for the first time, talking about a lot of these issues.
One of the things that I particularly value, because I was the early reader of this material, that I love seeing in there is her explanation of the necessity of checks and balances. And with one world government, you cannot have, as effectively at least, any kind of system of checks and balances. And so that would be a primary reason not to want that, yeah.
From that section, yeah. Good.
We got time for one last question right here.
The concept of free things that somebody has to provide is tantamount to slavery. And there's one party in this country for 200 years that has supported that deal.
But there is another party that is more and more supporting that deal as well, which is the Republicans. And immediately what came into my mind is Trump now promising the so-called covering of pre-existing conditions in any replacement for Obamacare. So we don't have a pure system, as you know. I love that graphic where you're going to the slaughter either way. You could choose the left slaughter or the right slaughter.
I would love to think that the Republicans were presenting a capitalist alternative to government control over healthcare, education, the Fed, anything else, but they're not. As Richard alluded to, Republicans are presenting a mixed economy. Some controls, a little bit of freedom, that's kind of up for grabs. So we need that real alternative, a capitalist alternative, an American alternative. It's up to all of our voices to make sure that that's heard and promoted in the years to come. Thank you all.
Thank you.